Four things today. 1. The post-war panic, the Red Scare, and the wave of racial violence that opens the decade. 2. The consumer economy Henry Ford basically invents: credit, radio, mass advertising. 3. Two cultural revolutions happening at once: the New Woman and the Harlem Renaissance, and the traditionalist backlash trying to shut both down. 4. How all of this quietly sets up the 1929 crash and creates the playbook for modern American politics. Chapter 21. The 1920s get remembered as one big party: flappers, jazz, Model Ts, but that's only half the decade. The other half is fear. Fear of communists, fear of immigrants, fear of black neighbors moving in next door, fear that the whole moral order is collapsing. This wasn't just a side effect of growth, it was the engine of the decade's politics. Prosperity on the surface, anxiety underneath it. That tension is the entire chapter. It's the feeling of a society moving so fast that half the people are trying to hit the gas, and the other half are desperate to find the brakes. Let's look at what happens when those two forces collide, starting with the deep unrest that followed the Great War. It's a decade that looks a lot like our own if you know where to look. 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution succeeds in Russia, and Western governments panic that the same thing is coming for them next. This wasn't just a vague worry. In 1919 alone, over 4 million American workers go on strike, including a massive steel strike and a Boston police strike that left the city unguarded. Then came the mail bombs. Radicals sent dozens of explosives to prominent officials, including Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. One actually exploded on Palmer's own front porch, destroying the front of his house and fueling a national obsession with rooting out subversives. This atmosphere of paranoia also led to the infamous trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants and anarchists whose conviction for murder was widely seen as a product of anti-immigrant bias rather than solid evidence. Palmer's response was swift and arguably unconstitutional. He launched the Palmer Raids, ordering government agents to round up thousands of suspected radicals across 30 cities. Many were arrested without warrants and held without access to lawyers. Anarchist Emma Goldman, a prominent activist, was among those deported to Russia. But here's the reality. Of the 4,000 people arrested, the government found grounds to actually deport barely 500. The overreach was so severe, it directly led to the founding of the ACLU in 1920, specifically to defend the Bill of Rights against this kind of state-led hysteria. It was a moment where fear nearly overrode the rule of law, setting a precedent for how the American government would handle perceived internal threats for decades to come. That same anxious summer of 1919 turned racial. During the Great Migration, over 400,000 black Southerners moved north for factory jobs. White workers, fearing competition for housing and employment, responded with extreme violence. Race riots break out in 25 cities. In Chicago, a black teenager named Eugene Williams drowned after being stoned for drifting into a whites-only section of a beach. In 1921, this peaked in Tulsa, where white mobs destroyed Greenwood, a wealthy black district known as the Negro Wall Street. They burned it to the ground, killing up to 300 people and leaving thousands homeless. This was a systematic erasure of black success, born from a fear that the old racial hierarchy was dissolving. The Tulsa Massacre was buried in the history books for nearly 80 years, a testament to how effectively a society can hide its most painful scars. While the streets were in turmoil, the factory floor was transforming the world. Henry Ford didn't just build cars, he perfected the assembly line. By 1925, a Model T was rolling off the line every 10 seconds. Ford understood something revolutionary. If you pay your workers enough to buy the products they build, you create your own market. He raised wages to $5 a day, double the average, which not only reduced worker turnover, but helped create the modern middle class. The roaring part of the 20s was powered by this new loop: high production, high wages, and high consumption. But it also required a culture that never stopped wanting more. Ford's assembly line also dehumanized labor, turning workers into cogs in a machine, a trade-off for the prosperity it promised. To keep that production loop moving, manufacturers poured money into a new advertising industry. Ad spending tripled over the decade. Ads targeted insecurities, bad breath, social status, the fear of not keeping up. Listerine literally popularized the term halitosis to sell mouthwash as a cure for a social disease. At the same time, the radio became the first truly national medium. For the first time, people in New York and Nebraska were hearing the same songs and laughing at the same jokes simultaneously. This created a genuinely national mass culture, breaking down regional isolation, but also creating a powerful new pressure toward conformity. Silent films also exploded, with stars like Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford becoming the first global celebrities, further homogenizing American values and desires. Because wages still don't quite cover this new lifestyle, companies invented modern installment credit. By the end of the decade, Americans were buying 60% of cars and 80% of radios on credit. Buy now, pay later became the actual national motto. Today, we see this same logic in fintech apps like Klarna or Affirm. They offer the same buy now, pay later promise at the checkout page, moving the 1920s installment plan from the furniture showroom to the smartphone. It's the same psychological engine, removing the immediate pain of payment to encourage a level of spending that the economy eventually couldn't sustain, a cycle of debt that remains a defining feature of American consumerism. As the economy shifted, so did the home. The new woman emerged as a direct challenge to Victorian morality. Flappers weren't just about short hair and skirts, they represented a demand for social autonomy. They smoked and drank in public, went to jazz clubs, and asserted a level of freedom their mother's generation couldn't have imagined. This was underpinned by the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gave women the right to vote and a new sense of political agency. However, this shift was met with intense policing. Some cities literally sent officers to beaches with rulers to measure the length of bathing suits. It was a fight over who got to control the female body in a rapidly modernizing world. This cultural tension between personal freedom and traditional authority would define the decade's domestic life. Margaret Sanger took this fight even further. As a nurse in poor immigrant communities, she saw the devastating toll of unwanted pregnancies and dangerous self-induced abortions. She became the era's leading advocate for birth control, directly challenging the Comstock laws, which banned the distribution of obscene materials. Her work was a radical assertion that women should have the right to decide their own reproductive futures. This wasn't just about medicine. It was about the fundamental right to self-determination, a debate that remains at the very center of American political life today. It was a challenge that the church and the state were both desperate to suppress, viewing her advocacy as a threat to the traditional family structure. While flappers were celebrating, many intellectuals were mourning. Gertrude Stein called them the lost generation. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis tore apart the myths of small-town America and corporate conformity. Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby exposed the hollow core of the American dream, showing that wealth couldn't actually buy the past or a meaningful future. They were disillusioned by a world war that had promised to make the world safe for democracy, but delivered mostly slaughter. Their work served as a dark mirror to the decade's optimism, suggesting that the Roaring Party was just a way to avoid the trauma of the trenches. They searched for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its moral compass, often finding only cynicism. Perhaps the most consequential shift was the Harlem Renaissance. As Harlem's black population surged, it became the heart of what philosopher Alain Locke called the New Negro movement. This was a cultural declaration of independence. It was a refusal to accept second-class citizenship, expressed through a burst of literature, art, and music. Poets like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston weren't just writing for white approval, they were expressing black identity on their own terms. Hughes's poetry captured the rhythm of jazz and the pain of the black experience, while Hurston explored the folklore of the South. Harlem became a mecca for black creativity, proving that cultural power could be a weapon against political oppression. It changed how America saw itself and how the world saw black Americans. Musicians like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith created the soundtrack of the decade. Jazz was born out of black working-class life, but it achieved global dominance, crossing over into white dance halls and radio programs, regardless of traditionalist opposition. It was the first truly American art form to capture the world's imagination. When Langston Hughes wrote that his generation intended to express themselves without fear or shame, he was speaking for a movement that prioritized self-determination. This wasn't a request for acceptance, it was a demand for full participation in the American story, built on a foundation of cultural excellence. Jazz became a symbol of the decade's energy, but also a point of intense friction for those who feared the contamination of white culture by black influence. But the movement wasn't unified. While Locke and the NAACP pushed for integration, Jamaican immigrant Marcus Garvey offered a different path through the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey preached racial separation, economic self-reliance, and a Back to Africa movement. He built the first true mass movement in Black American history with 500,000 members. He understood the power of pageantry and racial pride, even as NAACP leaders like Du Bois called his approach dangerous. This split, integration versus building independent Black economic and cultural power, is the same strategic argument running through Black political thought for the next century, echoed in the split between integrationist civil rights leaders and Black Power organizers in the 1960s, and still audible in conversations today. The clash between modernism and fundamentalism reached its peak in the Scopes trial of 1925. In Dayton, Tennessee, teacher John Scopes was recruited by the ACLU to break the law by teaching evolution in a public school. The resulting monkey trial became a national spectacle, broadcast live on the radio. Famed attorney Clarence Darrow defended Scopes and the principle of scientific inquiry, while William Jennings Bryan, a three-time presidential candidate and fundamentalist leader, prosecuted, defending a literal interpretation of the Bible. The trial's climax came when Darrow called Bryan himself to the stand as an expert on the Bible, exposing the inconsistencies in a literalist worldview. Scopes was ultimately convicted and fined $100, but the trial exposed a deep rift that has never truly healed. It was a summary of the whole decade, the fight over whether modern science or religious tradition should define the American mind. This debate over secularism and religion in public schools remains a dormant volcano in our politics, frequently erupting in new forms. Traditionalists fought back on multiple fronts. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, was aimed at the immigrant-heavy saloon culture. It failed to stop drinking, instead funding organized crime empires like Al Capone's. Meanwhile, nativism led to the National Origins Act of 1924, which used the 1890 census to freeze out Southern and Eastern Europeans. This fear fueled the Second Ku Klux Klan, which claimed millions of members by targeting Black Americans, Catholics, and Jews. They saw themselves as the defenders of a native, white Protestant identity that they felt was being erased by the roaring urban culture of the cities. It was a desperate attempt to legislate a disappearing past. The Klan's influence even reached into state governments, particularly in Indiana, before collapsing under its own corruption and scandal. Underpinning all of this was a pro-business government. Republican presidents Harding and Coolidge preached laissez-faire. The chief business of the American people is business. They cut taxes for the wealthy and looked the other way during scandals like Teapot Dome, where the Secretary of the Interior took bribes to lease federal oil reserves. While the economy grew at 7% a year, the prosperity was dangerously narrow. Farm income was dropping as agricultural prices collapsed after the war. Most Americans were living near the poverty line, and the stock market was becoming a speculative bubble fueled by buying on margin, borrowing 90% of the money to buy stocks. The government's refusal to intervene allowed the bubble to grow until it was structurally impossible to maintain, a period of Coolidge prosperity that was much more fragile than it appeared. In October 1929, the bubble popped. On Black Tuesday, stock prices went into freefall. The collapse of overextended banks and consumer credit rippled through the entire economy, proving that prosperity built on debt and narrow wealth is a house of cards. This culture war lineup, Prohibition's morality laws, the fight over science in schools, and restrictive immigration, is the exact same lineup of fights playing out in American politics today. The specific policies change, but the underlying anxieties about identity and values remain remarkably consistent. The 1920s didn't just end, they created the playbook for the next century of American political and cultural conflict. The Great Depression that followed would be the ultimate reckoning for the decade's excesses. To summarize Chapter 21, it was 2 decades running at once. A consumer and cultural revolution driven by Ford, jazz, and flappers, and a traditionalist backlash through the Red Scare, Prohibition, and immigration quotas. Remember the contrast pairs: the new woman versus fundamentalism, Locke's integration versus Garvey's separatism, and laissez-faire rhetoric versus actual pro-business intervention. The 1929 crash was the inevitable result of unequal prosperity, wild speculation, and an over-reliance on credit. These aren't just historical facts, they are the structural themes that continue to define the American experiment. Knowing these patterns helps us understand why the same fights keep coming back, just in different clothes. Prosperity on the surface can hide real structural weakness underneath, whether that's an economy running on debt or a culture papering over unresolved fights about who really belongs. It was true in the 1920s, and it's a question worth asking of our own world today. Get your Chapter 21 source response done in Canvas, and be ready to see how this roaring boom turns into the Great Depression. This isn't just history, it's the foundation of where we are now. See you in Chapter 22.